start. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Skeptical Inquirer Presents. This is a series of live online presentations from experts who are devoted to advancing science over pseudoscience, media literacy over conspiracy theories, and of course, critical thinking over magical thinking. I'm your host, Leanne Board. I'm an award-winning stand-up comedian, author, and CFI fellow. Woohoo! Hello, and thanks to those of you who are watching the recording. I see you. And of course, welcome to those of you who are joining us live. You have the opportunity to ask questions of our guests by typing them into the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. But to all of you, please be sure to check out the latest episode of Point of Inquiry, available wherever you get your podcasts. And if you haven't already, round out your reading list with Skeptical Inquirer magazine, and you can subscribe to that at skepticalinquirer.org. And of course, don't forget, SciCon is right around the corner, everybody. October 24th through the 27th in Las Vegas, or as I like to say, Vegas, baby. I should stop saying that. Today, by the way, is Air Conditioning Appreciation Day. And if I had it, I really would appreciate it. It's so hot. It's also National Doghouse Repair Month. So if you have a doghouse and you've been putting off the repairs, well, now's the time. You heard it here first and probably nowhere else ever again. And now on to the main event. As I'm sure you know, there have been multiple controversies over the teaching of evolution in public schools that have rocked the nation over the past century. But while opponents have used the same arguments, their ambitions have shifted. They've moved from outright banning the teaching of evolution to balancing it with supposed alternatives to blunting it through the claims that evolution is scientifically disputed. I guess you can say their tactics have evolved. Our guest, CSI fellow, Glenn Branch is here with us to discuss the causes, history, and consequences of these various controversies. He'll outline the encouraging developments in evolution education over the past 15 years, as revealed by a National Center for Science Education Studies. And he'll share what skeptics have done and can continue to do to help. Glenn is Deputy Director of the National Center for Science Education. The center is a nonprofit organization that defends the integrity of American science education against ideological interference. And might I say thank you for that work. His numerous articles on evolution education and obstacles to them have appeared in Scientific American, American Educator, and the Annual Review of Human Genetics and Genomics. In 2020, he received the Evolution Education Award from the National Association of Biology Teachers. And side note, I think my high school biology teacher, Mr. Guastella, wherever he is, really would have loved this. And with that, please welcome to the Skeptical Inquirer Presents screen, Glenn Branch. Glenn, pop in and take it away.
Thanks for that introduction, Leanne. As a longtime subscriber and contributor to Skeptical Inquirer and a fairly recent fellow of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, I'm delighted to be speaking for Skeptical Inquirer Presents. I'm going to be talking about controversies over the teaching of evolution in the public schools, as you see, which is about a century-long story, but I'll try to be a bit briefer than that. It's a tolerably notorious fact that scientists overwhelmingly accept evolution. About 98% of US scientists belonging to the American Association for the Advancement of Science, according to a 2015 survey from the Pew Research Center. While the US public is not quite so squared away, only 65% of them in the same survey. What's the reason for the disconnect? In a book review published in the New York Times in 1989, Richard Dawkins offered a handful of possible diagnoses, saying, if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked. But he didn't attempt to test these competing hypotheses. They can't be tested. In a 2012 US survey, for example, the common ancestry of humans and other animals was accepted by only 48% of respondents. But the claim that the theory of evolution involves the common ancestry of humans and other animals was accepted by 72% of respondents. To understand what's going on here, let's look at the crosstabs. Slightly more than half of the evolution deniers lacked even a minimal understanding of evolution, insofar as they did not agree that the theory of evolution involves the common ancestry of humans and other animals. And slightly less than half of the evolution deniers rejected evolution while displaying at least this minimal understanding of what it in fact involves. So about half of our evolution deniers are clearly ignorant. Is it plausible that the other half, about a quarter of the US population, are stupid, insane, or wicked? That would be rather disturbing if so. But there's a neglected alternative. Someone can understand evolution yet reject it if they're in the grips of an ideology that prevents them from accepting it. What could such an ideology be? Something religious in nature, sure, but we can be more exact than that. Evolution denial is largely driven by inerrantism, the view that the Bible is without error in all it teaches, including not only matters of faith and morals, but also matters of history and science. And hey, about a quarter of the US population reports taking an inerrantist view of the Bible. Inerrantists can and do disagree about what the Bible in fact teaches. Every view to the northwest of theistic evolution on this chart is basically an inerrantist position, and they differ greatly in what they claim, including flat earthers. But they all agree that God separately created living things after their own kind, meaning that evolution between kinds, whatever they are, is impossible. Now, in a liberal, diverse, cosmopolitan society, we tolerate people having ideologies that we don't share or even deplore, so long as they don't attempt to impose them on others or otherwise to interfere with their legitimate interests. This is a statue of tolerance in a park in Brno in the Czech Republic. But in the case of inerrancy-driven evolution denial, or creationism, there's been a long and inglorious history of such attempts in the US. They've been focused on the place where evolution is aired more consistently and to a wider audience than anywhere else, the public school system, which retains remarkably few little red schoolhouses, despite the illustration. When you think about evolution in the public schools, you might first think of the teachers involved in the high-profile court cases over the teaching of evolution that for 99 years now have shaped the public consciousness of the issue, starting with John T. Scopes, a young general science teacher in Dayton, Tennessee. In 1925, a bill called the Butler Act, after its sponsor, John Washington Butler, passed the Tennessee legislature and was signed into law. The new law made it illegal to teach in a state-supported school, quote, any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. Scopes was recruited as the defendant in a test case by businessmen eager to promote Dayton, and the resulting trial was widely publicized. Scopes was convicted, but the conviction was overturned on appeal on a technicality, and the Butler Act remained on the books until 1967, exerting a chilling influence on the teaching of evolution. Still thinking about teachers involved in legal cases over the teaching of evolution, there's Susan Epperson, who challenged Arkansas's Scopes-era ban on the teaching of evolution in the mid-1960s, after evolution started to make its way back into textbooks, as the United States was trying to improve science education as part of the space race with the Soviet Union. The case wound its way to the Supreme Court, which in 1968 ruled that the ban violated the First Amendment to the US Constitution. Scopes was still alive, and he welcomed the decision. The following year, Epperson and Scopes had lunch together in Shreveport, Louisiana, where he was retired. Scopes died in 1970, the next year. Still thinking about teachers involved in legal cases over the teaching of evolution, here's Donald Aguillard, the lead plaintiff in a case case challenging in 1982 Louisiana state law requiring equal time for something called creation science, a repackaging of the Genesis accounts of creation in supposedly scientific garb, so as to balance the teaching of evolution in the state's public schools. This case also wound its way to the Supreme Court, which in 1987 ruled that the equal time for creation science law also violated the First Amendment to the US Constitution. And as you see from the uncropped version of the last photograph, here we have Aguillard standing next to a brightly orange-clad Susan Epperson. Or finally, you might think of the teachers at Dover Area High School in Dover, Pennsylvania. When they were directed by their school board in 2004 to read a statement to their students deprecating evolution and recommending intelligent design, a repackaging of creationism that was hoped to survive constitutional scrutiny, they refused en masse. A lawsuit over the school board's actions had already been filed by 11 local parents, led by Tammy Kitzmiller, with the support of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, the ACLU of Pennsylvania, the Philadelphia law firm Pepper Hamilton, and a plucky science education outfit, my employer, the National Center for Science Education. The folks you see here were the plaintiffs' expert witnesses, including 2 members of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, outlined in red, Barbara Forrest and Kenneth R. Miller. The teachers were not party to the trial in which the school board's actions were challenged as unconstitutional. They and their legal advisors decided that it would be counterproductive, but they were delighted to see the outcome of the case, Kitzmiller versus Dover, announced in letters 2 inches tall on the front page of the Harrisburg Patriot News. Judging from that whistle-stop tour of the history, you might conclude that through 100 years of controversy, all teachers have always been heroic defenders of evolution. If so, I wonder if you would be interested in purchasing this unique landmark. Truth be told, in the tales of the creationism evolution controversy, teachers are sometimes among the villains. In 1987, for example, Ray Webster, a social studies teacher at this junior high school in New Lenox, Illinois, was presenting creation science to his students, ostensibly to encourage them to explore alternative viewpoints. The district superintendent told him to knock it off, and Webster filed a suit against the district as a result, alleging that his constitutional rights were violated. But by the time that the court ruled, 1989, the unconstitutionality of a teacher's presenting creation science had already been established by the Supreme Court, and Webster could hardly have a constitutional right to engage in unconstitutional behavior. Plus, in general, school districts have a right to tell their teachers what and how to teach. In 1994, similarly, John Pelosa, a biology teacher at this high school in Mission Viejo, California, sued his school district for requiring him to teach evolution, which, he contended, violated his constitutional rights because, he said, evolution is a religious belief system opposed to, and indeed the only alternative to, creationism. The district court didn't see any merit to this contention, writing, since the evolutionist theory is not a religion, to require an instructor to teach this theory is not a violation of the Establishment Clause. And Pelosa didn't fare any better on appeal. And, like Webster, Pelosa didn't have any constitutional right to preach creationism on the government's time clock. And in 2000, Rodney LeVake, a teacher at this high school in Faribault, Minnesota, refused to teach evolution without teaching, quote, the difficulties and inconsistencies of the theory. The district reassigned him to teach 9th grade general science instead, and LeVake sued the district, alleging, you guessed it, that his constitutional rights had been violated. Interestingly, unlike Webster and Pelosa, LeVake claimed that he was only seeking to teach the evidence for and the evidence against evolution, not to teach creationism. But the supposed evidence against evolution he cited clearly had its genesis, you should pardon the expression, in the creationist literature and lacked any scientific credibility. The tactic of offering scientifically unwarranted criticisms of evolution while trying to remain as silent as possible about any supposed alternative was pretty new at the time, but even then made a lot of sense, since the prospects of intelligent design surviving constitutional scrutiny were not good, as the Kitzmiller trial demonstrated 5 years later in 2005. In Levake's case, the district asked for and won a summary judgment, so the case never reached trial. Undaunted, Levake subsequently appealed the case to a Minnesota Court of Appeals, which upheld the ruling. The Minnesota Supreme Court and finally the US Supreme Court declined to review the case in 2001 and 2002, respectively, so that was the end of the line for Levake. So we've looked at a small number of teachers who have been heroes of evolution education, and a small number of teachers who have been villains of evolution education. And if you're jumping to conclusions on the basis of either or both, then Dr. Zoidberg, the lobstery physician from Futurama, wants to have a word with you. If you want to understand what's really being taught about evolution in American public school classrooms, you need to do some survey research, or Pullink, as they say in Germany. As it happens, there have apparently been only 3 representative national surveys of science educators with regard to evolution. Let me emphasize national and representative. There have been a lot of these surveys confined to more or less narrow geographic areas, and there have been a lot that have used convenience samples, like all the teachers who attended a particular conference. But again, only 3 surveys that can claim to have given an accurate picture of the state of evolution education nationally. The first of these dates from 1939-1940. The lead researcher on the survey, Oscar Riddle, 1877 to 1968, was a distinguished biologist who was deeply concerned about helping teachers resist, quote, the anti-evolutionary pressure of dogmatic religious groups, as his biographer put it. And he was a co-founder of the National Association of Biology Teachers in the wake of the Scopes trial. Riddle and his team mailed about 15,000 questionnaires to high school biology teachers across the US, receiving about 3,200 responses. The questionnaire asked a lot of questions about various topics, but teaching and not teaching organic evolution was a major part of it. The survey found that about 10% of high school biology teachers personally rejected evolution. Even worse, the survey found that only about 54% of high school biology teachers were teaching evolution as a central principle of biology. Even some of these teachers were still steering clear of human evolution, which was the main focus of the Scopes era legislation, like the Butler Act. And so, all told, only about 51% were teaching evolution without compromise. Fast forward to 2005, when the Kitzmiller trial was underway in the federal courthouse in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. 100 miles to the northwest, a couple of parents with children in the public schools were paying close attention. But they weren't just any parents. They were political scientists at Penn State who worked on education policy. Michael Berkman and Eric Plutzer realized that there had not been a national survey of high school biology teachers addressing evolution education since the Riddle survey of 1939-1940. With a student, Juliana Sandel Pacheco, Berkman and Plutzer conducted such a survey in 2007, thus giving the first national look at evolution education in 67 years. Among the headline results, as reported, were that 28% of public high school biology teachers were presenting evolution forthrightly, while 13% were presenting creationism as scientifically credible, and the remaining 60% were, while not presenting creationism as scientifically credible, were skimping on their teaching of evolution in one way or another. Plutzer and I later went back to the 2007 data, and we realized that the first 2 of those categories were not defined to be mutually exclusive. We proposed a new typology according to whether teachers reported endorsing evolution and whether they reported endorsing creationism. That results in a 4-fold categorization that's mutually exclusive and exhaustive. We can nickname these teachers. Eve presents evolution as settled science, giving no credence whatsoever to creationism. Mimi sends mixed messages, saying that evolution is accepted by scientists, but saying that there's something to creationism too. Avery avoids discussing the scientific standing of evolution and creationism. Craig says that creationism is good science, but evolution is not. When we look at the data from 2007, you might think that things look pretty good. We have a majority of teachers, 51%, who are Eves, presenting evolution as settled science. But remember that the Riddle survey found that only 51% of teachers were presenting evolution as a central principle of biology. Does that mean there was no progress at all in 67 years? No, the Riddle survey had a sampling bias and a response bias, making it likely that teachers who presented evolution as a central principle of biology were overrepresented. The questions used in the Riddle survey and the Berkman and Plutzer survey aren't exactly comparable. And in any case, these questions only measure a small part of what makes for good or bad evolution education. But still, yikes. In 2019, one of the researchers from the Berkman et al. Survey of 2007 mentioned before, and staff from NCSE collaborated on a partial replication of the 2007 survey. And we published a report on it about 4 years ago in 2020 in the journal Evolution, Education, and Outreach. There are the proud parents, Eric Plutzer of Penn State, me, and my colleague Ann Reed. Good news. In 2007, the average number of hours devoted to teaching evolution in general was 9.8 hours, with human evolution in particular receiving 4.1 hours. But in 2019, the average number of hours devoted to teaching evolution was up to 12.4 hours, a rise of 25%, with human evolution in particular receiving 7.7 hours, a rise of 90%, almost doubled. It wouldn't be true progress, of course, unless the increased discussion of evolution was scientifically accurate. What were these teachers saying about evolution? We evaluated this through our fourfold typology, which I display here again. Eve, evolution as settled science, which is what we want to see, Mimi, mixed messages, Avery, avoidance, and Craig, creation advocacy. When we compare the 2007 and 2019 surveys, there was definite progress. From 51% of high school biology teachers as Eves in 2007 to 67% in 2019. This was matched by drops in the Mimi teachers endorsing both evolution and creationism, the Averys avoiding endorsing either, and the Craigs endorsing creationism without endorsing evolution. With about 4 million students enrolled in high school biology classes in the public school system in any given year, the gains for accurate, complete, and honest evolution education are clearly enormous. But it's still a matter of concern that so many of these teachers, more than 1 in 6, 17.6%, are Mimis and Craigs who present creationism as scientifically credible. Why is that? Our go-to explanations, as we've seen, are ignorance and ideology. Let's start with ignorance. To assess teachers' awareness of the scientific consensus on evolution, we ask them to estimate by quintile what proportion of scientists think that humans and other living things have evolved over time. Remember, according to a 2015 survey, 98% do, so the correct quintile is 81 to 100%. High school biology teachers did pretty well on this question, with 71% selecting the correct quintile, 92% selecting the top 2 quintiles. We actually don't have as fine-grained data for the general public, but in the same 2015 survey of scientists, only 65% of the general public agreed that scientists generally agree with evolution. So it seems that ignorance isn't playing a big role here. How about ideology? The personal religious beliefs of teachers apparently plays a large role in their choice of what themes to emphasize in their classroom. Presented with the options used by Gallup in its polling on evolution and creationism, 4% of Eves, 12% of Mimis, 25% of Averys, and a whopping 60% of Craigs in 2019 agreed with the creationist option. And it should be unsurprising, given what I said before about creationism being driven primarily by inerrantism, to see a connection here. Only 3% of Eves, but 16% of Mimis, 11% of Averys, and a substantial 32% of Craigs in 2019 agreed with the claim the Bible is the actual word of God and is to be taken literally word for word. Even here, there is encouraging news. In the 2007 survey, 16% of all the teachers surveyed agreed with the creationist option when presented with the Gallup question, while in the 2019 survey, only 10.5% did, suggesting that creationists are decreasingly likely to be represented among public high school biology teachers. By the way, the decrease in creationism among high school biology teachers significantly outpaced the decrease in creationism among the general public, which fell from 46% in 2007 to 40% in 2019, according to Gallup. So that's a drop of a bit more than a third among the teachers, as compared to a drop of less than a sixth among the general public. But the personal religious beliefs of teachers isn't responsible for the entire shift. Since NCSE, where I work, was intimately involved in the Kitzmiller case, having assembled the legal team representing the plaintiffs, provided the expert witnesses, and supported the legal team throughout the case, it would be nice to think that the sweeping legal victory played a role. Alas, the evidence does not point that way. In 2003, for example, Randy Moore administered a questionnaire about the legal issues over teaching evolution and creationism in the public schools to a convenient sample of Minnesota high school biology teachers. And Moore found that a large majority of them were already aware that's unconstitutional to teach creationism in the public schools. Instead, in our study of the 2019 survey, we concluded that improvement in the treatment of evolution in state science standards played a major role in producing the improvements in the treatment of evolution in the classroom. And to explain how, I'll need to talk a bit about state science standards. State science standards are documents that specify what knowledge and skills students are expected to acquire during their education. Pretty much as soon as they started to be introduced across the country in the 1990s as part of the push for outcome-based education, it was clear to everybody that if evolution was going to be in the state standards, it was more likely to make it into the classroom. That's not only because science standards determine the content of statewide science examinations, but also because they set the agenda for pre-service and in-service teacher coursework, affect the content of biology textbooks, and provide guidelines for the science curricula. And of course, they can act as a shield to beleaguered teachers. Creationists were quick to tinker with standards to advance their cause. As early as 1995, the Alabama State Board of Education inserted a provision in the state science standards that required evolution not to be presented dogmatically, and then used that to require a scientifically illiterate disclaimer to be affixed to all biology textbooks used in the state. Visible attempts to undermine the treatment of evolution in state science standards have occurred across the country over the last 25 years in at least 20 states, shown in red here, including states that you might not have guessed, Hawaii, really, and I might have forgotten a few. Who's waging these fights? Frequently, evolution's foes are on the State Board of Education, especially in states where the board is elected. Alabama, as we've seen, Kansas, and Texas, where for years a creationist faction held sway on the board, including former chair Don McElroy, who famously explained what he saw as his role. Someone's got to stand up to experts. Sometimes the anti-evolutionists are in the Department of Education, with the most conspicuous recent case being the former superintendent of public instruction in Arizona, Diane Douglas, who tried to downplay evolution and a new set of state science standards there in 2018. She was ultimately unsuccessful and not coincidentally voted out of office. Sometimes the anti-evolutionists are in the legislature. In Iowa, Sandy Salmon introduced a string of bills that would have prevented the state from adopting a new set of standards, would have reversed the adoption of those standards, would have prevented the state from requiring use of those new standards, and so on. Fortunately, none of her bills was successful. And that's to say nothing of the grassroots opposition to the treatment of evolution in state science standards. It usually doesn't take place in person, so we don't see a lot of protesters like this. More typically, it occurs when the public is invited, as it should be, to comment on draft science standards. It can be entertaining or dismaying to read the comments on evolution. Seldom will the grassroots rally as much as they did in Kansas in 2013, where a creationist group filed a federal lawsuit against the state for adopting a new set of evolution-friendly standards on the grounds that it constituted, quote, the establishment of a non-theistic religious worldview. They lost at every step in their court battle. But even where there haven't been such battles, there's no reason for complacency. In 2009, two of my colleagues assessed the treatment of evolution in state science standards. The states marked with the darker colors were doing worse. There have been some changes in the last 15 years, most of them, I'm pleased to say, for the better. The biggest development in state science standards in the last 10 years was the release of the Next Generation Science Standards, or NGSS, in 2013. These are a model set of standards developed by a consortium of nonprofit organizations in 26 states using up-to-date science and equally up-to-date pedagogy. The NGSS highlight biological evolution, unity, and diversity as a disciplinary core idea of the life sciences at the high school and the middle school levels. 20 states, plus the District of Columbia, have adopted the NGSS, and a further 25 states have now adopted standards based on the same evolution-friendly framework on which the NGSS are based. NGSS states were not especially hospitable to the teaching of evolution before. In 2007, their teachers were a shade less likely to endorse evolution and not creationism, to be Eves, than the national average. By 2019, they were a shade more likely to be Eves than the national average, 69% as compared to 67%. While a variety of explanations are possible, teachers in NGSS states reported having taken more pre-service and in-service coursework in evolution than their colleagues elsewhere. These are pre-service teachers at Cornell University. And this suggests that the increased expectations of the NGSS impelled both novice and veteran teachers to upgrade their content knowledge of evolution and to be able to teach it better. So it seems that substantial improvements in science education, even for a socially contentious topic such as evolution, are attainable by improving the state's science standards and equipping teachers with the wherewithal to comply with them. That's certainly something celebrating and certainly nothing to rue. Sorry. But there's still work to be done. I've been talking mainly about high school biology teachers, since evolution is typically presented most thoroughly in high school biology classes. But evolution and its conceptual components usually appear first in middle school life and earth sciences classes, where it provides a vital basis for future learning, as in the NGSS seen here. There are heroes and villains among middle school science teachers too. Bertha Vasquez is a middle school science teacher in Miami, now retired, who runs the Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science, affiliated with the Richard Dawkins Foundation and the Center for Inquiry, which has been providing evolution education workshops to middle school educators since 2015. But John Freshwater taught 8th grade science in this Mount Vernon, Ohio middle school until 2011, when he was sacked, in part because he was presenting, as Rodney LeVake sought to present, what he described as evidence for and evidence against evolution, where the evidence against evolution was based, of course, on crude creationist propaganda. The Freshwater affair got a lot of press attention for other reasons, since Freshwater was accused of engaging in religious proselytizing of various forms in his classroom. Especially disturbing were the allegations that Freshwater improperly used a high voltage electrostatic device to mark students' arms with a cross. Yikes. But again, Dr. Zoidberg admonishes us that's a pretty small sample. And until recently, the total number of middle school science teachers surveyed with respect to evolution was about 110, distributed among half a dozen studies. Fortunately, the NCSC Penn State survey in 2019 included a nationally representative sample of middle school science teachers too. The NCSE Penn State team published a report on the middle school results, a sibling to the previous report on the high school results, in 2021, again in the journal Evolution Education Outreach. These are the proud parents, me, I got to be the lead author this time, Eric Pletzer of Penn State, and my colleague Ann Reed. Middle school science teachers, including junior high school science teachers. So we're talking about teachers with students in grades 6 through 9, ages 11 through 15. These teachers are the Swiss Army knives of science teachers. They're generalists, with most of their classes covering a mixture of earth and space sciences, life sciences, chemistry, and physics. So it wasn't surprising that only 45% of middle school science teachers reporting devoting any class time to human evolution, only 60% to evolution in general. This is in comparison to 78% and 91% of high school biology teachers, respectively. On average, evolution gets 17.2 class hours in a high school biology class, but only 9.1 class hours in a middle school science class. But not all middle school science teachers are supposed to be teaching evolution. Restricting comparison to those teachers who reported devoting at least one class hour to evolution, the difference narrows, 18.6 class hours versus 14.6. That is, when middle school science teachers cover evolution, they spend only 22% less time on the subject than do their high school colleagues. Are they emphasizing the scientific consensus on evolution? Again, restricting comparison to those teachers who reported devoting at least one class hour to evolution, we found that a bare majority of them are Eves, 51.5%, while about equal numbers are Mimis and Averys, and 9.3% of them are Craigs. This is pretty similar in distribution to the high school numbers from 2007, actually. This shows you the comparison with the high school numbers from 2019. It's not that surprising that high school biology teachers are doing a better job at emphasizing the scientific consensus on evolution than middle school teachers. But can we sort out the causes of this divergence? To some extent. Returning to our go-to explanations of ignorance and ideology, middle school teachers are clearly more likely to be ignorant of the extent of the scientific consensus on evolution, even though a solid majority of them estimate the level of consensus in the correct quintile. Again, we don't have such fine-grained data for the general public, but it's safe to say that middle school science teachers are doing better than the general public. As for ideology, when we compare their personal beliefs, we find that middle school science teachers are twice as likely as high school biology teachers, 19.7% to 10.5%, to accept the creationist option in the Gallup question, although they're only half as likely to accept it as a general public, 19.7% to 40.1%. So ideology clearly plays a role. We lack a time series of data for middle school science teachers, so we can't say for sure that there's been progress. But given the remarkable progress on the part of their high school counterparts over just a dozen years, it seems very plausible that there's been a similar, if smaller, improvement at the middle school level and for the same basic reasons. Prediction is uncertain, especially about the future, but let me offer a three-part forecast for evolution education in the United States. First, we are not going to see any significant anti-evolution policy enacted, whether in the form of legislation or in attacks on standards. That's not to say, of course, that there won't be attempts to enact such policies. I feel confident that there will be, especially given the Supreme Court's recent decision in Kennedy versus Bremerton, which weakened the constitutional separation of church and state, and in the process, casually overturned the half-century of case law underlying the decisions that repulsed previous creationist encroachments on evolution education. In 2021, Mary Bentley in Arkansas sought to allow teachers to teach creationism, quote, as a theory of how the earth came to exist, which it isn't. Still, her bill passed the House before being defeated on the narrowest of votes, 3-3, in a Senate committee. But if such a policy is enacted, as it might be, judging from this near miss in 2021, it will be swiftly challenged in the courts, and it will be hard to defend, even in the wake of Kennedy versus Bremerton. Second prediction, it's going to be a long time before the evolution wars end, owing to the decentralization of American education, with 13,500 odd local school districts having primary responsibility for curriculum and instruction. These are the district boundaries of the lower 48. Improvements in evolution education are inevitably going to be slow, scattered, and incremental. And constant vigilance is needed at the local level to detect and organize resistance to creationist encroachments on the integrity of science education. This is a mildly sexist Scopes-era cartoon. The skeptical movement in general and the Center for Inquiry have done a lot of excellent work in this regard, with the Kitzmiller versus Dover case being only one example. But third and finally, the signs for the long term are promising. Look at this graph of American public opinion on evolution from 1985 to 2020. The gray shading indicates the 99% confidence interval. So for the last 14 years, since 2012, we can be pretty confident that acceptance of evolution was more common among the American public than rejection. Creationism may not be on the ropes yet, but it's headed that way. There are two basic approaches to improving public acceptance and understanding of evolution, corresponding to our familiar arch nemeses, ignorance and ideology. First, increasing the amount and quality of teacher coursework in evolution and pedagogical methods for teaching evolution effectively. We've already seen how improvements in state science standards in the US can induce such increases. Bear in mind, though, that although formal education is really important, so is informal education through venues like natural history museums. This is the Carnegie Museum of Natural History when a traveling exhibit on evolution was visiting. And through the media, and efforts to increase the amount and quality of evolution in informal education deserve our support too. The second approach to improving public understanding and acceptance of evolution involves the ideologies that stand in the way of teaching evolution, sometimes carrying signs. Of course, it's neither possible nor desirable to try to directly change the ideologies of teachers, parents, members of the community who harbor ideological reservations about evolution. We don't want to do any brainwashing, but it's possible to make evolution less threatening to such people. For example, by showing them that there are people who share their values, yet accept the science, such as Francis Collins, the former director of the National Institutes of Health and an evangelical Christian, or Kenneth R. Miller, not only a CSI fellow and the co-author of a popular series of high school biology textbooks, but also a Catholic. A different approach, and one perhaps more suited to a secularist group like the Center for Inquiry, is to make evolution less threatening by appealing to widely shared values that are neither religious nor anti-religious. Through, for example, Darwin Day events, which show that learning about evolution can be interesting and exciting and accompanied by scrumptious cake. The National Center for Science Education is active on three fronts. First, we act as a crisis clinic for those facing challenges to evolution education in their schools, districts, and states. We've been doing that for a long time. That, of course, is our new office. Since climate change education is now under similar attack, by the way, we added it to our portfolio a few years ago. Second, we conduct high quality and high impact research on science education, including the two surveys on evolution education that I've discussed today, but also two similar surveys on climate education and a recent study of climate change and state science standards. A third survey on evolution, climate change, and the nature of science was completed earlier this year. Third, NCSC has a program aimed at preparing teachers to effectively teach socially, but not scientifically, controversial topics, such as evolution and climate change, coordinating high-quality programming for teachers across the country. At NCSC, we're working as hard and as smart as we can to defend and promote the teaching of evolution and climate change. We value our alliances with the skeptical community. We value your support, and I in particular appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. Thanks for your attention and interest.
Glenn, thank you. Thank you so much for that, that presentation. We only have a couple of questions, but I know I have a few as well. And this one, and I apologize, is probably overly simplistic, but if the teaching of creationism is so important to parents, if they are going with the biblical or the religious connection, why don't they just send their kids to Sunday school? Or do they
Well,
actually realize how hard teaching kids is and they don't want to do it?
a lot of creationist parents indeed send their children to Sunday school or teach them about creationism at home. A fair number of them take their children out of the public school system and either have them in fundamentalist Christian schooling or homeschooling. Probably something like about 3% of American school-age students are in homeschooling or private schooling. And a fair number of their parents report on surveys that one reason they've left the public school system is because they want more religion in their children's education, although the surveys are not fine-grained enough to drill down to evolution and creationism. But of
And
course, many
please,
parents
sir.
can't afford or have other reasons for wanting to keep their students in the public school system. And they have to somehow make their peace with the fact evolution and not creationism is going to be taught, or they kick up a fuss.
Got it. I was actually going to ask, that leads directly to my next question. When these surveys of teachers, biology teachers, is that mainly public school teachers? Does that include private school teachers and homeschool teachers? Like, is there a breakout of those particular groups, or are they just aggregated as public school teachers?
In the 2007 and 2019 surveys that NCSC participated in, those are all public school teachers.
Public school teachers. Okay, that makes
Teachers
sense.
in private schools and home schools, again, are a fairly small proportion of the science teaching population, and we didn't think it was worth the effort to survey them. If anyone else has the interest in funds, I'd love to see the results.
Agreed. Yeah, you gotta go for more bang for your buck, as
Exactly.
well as I neglected to say I admire what you're doing, and of course everything is better with cake. It just absolutely is. Um, Howard has asked a couple of questions here. One, he wants to know that after evolution and climate change, which scientific concept would you place third on your list of those that are endangered?
Um, I think this is Howard from the Bay Area. Hi, Howard. Um, I would say it's not so much an area of science as a deep characteristics of science, which can be summed up as nature of science and trust in science. Um,
Mhm.
Science teachers these days will tell you that sure, they want their students to learn some basic facts about science, but equally as important, perhaps more important, they should understand what kind of enterprise the scientific enterprise is and why, when properly done, it produces results that we can be justifiably confident in. Um, Many commentators have noticed there seems to be a crisis in public trust in scientists and public confidence in science, not in general usually, just in places where their values are impinged. So creationists rejecting evolution because of their religious values, climate change deniers rejecting climate change because of their economic ideals and political ideals, um, anti-vaxxers rejecting vaccination because of concerns about health and purity. Um, these all suggest that there's a problem with Americans' understanding of what science is and what it can be expected to do and not to do, and consequently of their trust in scientists and their confidence in the scientific enterprise. So that is the third item that I would list along with evolution and climate change that NCC is concerned about.
That's very well said, and actually very well piggybacks on the guest we had a couple of weeks ago. I'm blanking on her name. Oh, that's right, Laura Lindenfeld from the Allen Alda School of Science Communication and Journalism, and she talked about that very thing. How do you restore that basic trust? How do you get people to even understand how science works before we even get to other the deeper questions or the specific questions. So thank you for that. And
And I'll
Howard also wants to know, yes, sir.
I was just going to put in a little further plug for the survey work that we did this year, where we asked a
Please.
nationally representative sample of middle school and high school teachers what they think about the nature of science, what they teach about it, what they think about trust in science, and what they teach about it. And we expect to have some very interesting results to report probably next year once we wrangle all the data.
That sounds like a return visit, hint, hint, Barry, if you're listening. I think that would be worth hearing here as well. But Howard's other question was, is there any interest in repeating your studies at the collegiate level, or once you get there, you're safe? Is that too much of an assumption?
We're probably not going to do a replication at the level of higher education. In general, one gets taught a lot more and a lot better about evolution at the college level for obvious reasons. You're being taught, for the most part, by evolutionary biologists with PhDs in the subject, and they generally know what they're doing. Of course, there's a degree of self-selection. There are Bible colleges and the like where creationism is taught wrongly as scientifically credible. But I don't think we would get as much bang for our buck, as you say, Leanne,
Yes.
with a survey at the collegiate level. So we're probably not going to do it.
And I love the way it's all coming together this evening. This leads to Cynthia, who says, as a college professor, I regularly have to dispel many students' long-held misunderstandings about evolution. Would you suggest an effective way to reach adults who have already been indoctrinated into believing creationism is scientific and prevent them from passing on misguided anti-evolution beliefs to their children? And that's hard once the foundation's been laid in, because I went to Catholic school and it's taken a long time to undo that damage. So, and she's seeing it on the collegiate level. She's getting the folks that are coming in. What do you say to Professor Cynthia? And thank you for that question.
It's a great question. It's very hard to answer because every case is different, because we're dealing with what Sherlock Holmes called the psychology of the individual. As I suggested broadly, when we're dealing with trying to combat the ideologies, one is to find ambassadors, people like Francis Collin or Kenneth R. Miller, or people who share the values broadly. Here, there will be religious values for the most part, but accept the science and say, here, Francis Collins is a evangelical Christian in good standing. He walks with God, but he accepts evolution on the basis of the evidence. So doesn't that give you an eensy-weensy feeling that maybe it might be all right? And of course, the other is to appeal to shared values that are neither religious nor anti-religious. For a parent with children, for example, I understand your concerns, but keep in mind that if your child doesn't learn about evolution, they're going to have more problems finding jobs in high-tech industry like biotech or medicine or even agriculture, where evolution is increasingly important. And they'll have more difficulty if they pursue further study in college or graduate school. They're going to have more problems there. They'll have to take the kind of remedial coursework that the questioner Cynthia was discussing.
I mean, on some level, you have to be conversant, at the very least, about these things. You can't be blindsided as a grown-up. Let's see. We do have a few. We have plenty of time. Marion wants to know, and I'd love to hear this as well. Would you comment on Louisiana passing the 10 Commandments in the classroom bill? I mean, that's a little outside, or maybe not. Would you mind commenting on that?
Well, it's a terrible idea. We all know it's unconstitutional from Stone v. Graham, although the current revanchist Supreme Court seems to like to ignore precedent. But it's not really in my wheelhouse. So I'll go with it's terrible and it's unconstitutional, but I don't have a lot of faith in the Supreme Court to do the right thing.
Whoever would have thought that. Um, Walter says that this goes back to what you've mentioned a couple of times now. You mentioned Dr. Collins. Do you know if he actually accepts evolution? And quoting here, I found it hard to understand how someone can be both evangelical and work as a modern biologist. I don't know how you square that circle either. But I mean, I don't think it's like being a Star Trek fan and loving someone who loves Star Wars. I think this is a little bit more complicated.
I think that Collins and Miller and many other scientists of faith are perfectly sincere in avowing their faith and accepting evolution. And some of them may feel cognitive dissonance and others, apparently don't. And they say, look, I know that my Redeemer liveth, and I know that the Bible is a inspired document, and I know that God created the heavens and the earth and everything within them, and I know that he used evolution to create this wonderful world with its multiplicity of forms of life. And they can go on in this vein, and if they're fine with it, then I don't have a problem with it, whether or not I share those beliefs myself.
Thank you. Daniel has an interesting question. Are there elements, or what are the elements in Europe that keep creationists on a leash, so to speak, better than we do here in the United States? Or do they?
That's a really great question. So one is, throughout much of Europe, there's a state church. Sometimes fairly vestigial, but a state church, as opposed to the US's DIY approach to religion. And it's been argued by, well, it's certainly true. You can
I'm sorry, that's hilarious.
You can have a revelation. Yeah. You can write your own scripture. You can hang out your shingle, and if you get enough followers, then you're a denomination. It's a lot harder to do that in Europe. It's generally permitted, but the state church will have institutional and historical advantages. So having a state church does kind of impose, not heavy-handedly, but it does impose a degree of doctrinal conformity. And most of the state churches of Europe have made their peace with evolution long ago, and most of their clergy, is fine with it. The other distinction is that curriculum throughout much of Europe is a national affair. I've heard it said that the Minister of Education in his office in Paris knows what page of what textbook is open in every school book throughout France at any given time. Probably an exaggeration, but whereas in the United States, where you've got 13,500 odd school districts with primary responsibility for curriculum and instruction, there are constant opportunities for creationists, whether they're teachers or not, to try to make headway, so they never really get totally discouraged. And keep in mind, one aspect of the new right back in the 1980s and of the MAGA movement in the last decade was encouraging their followers to get their start in politics by running for the local school board. And because nobody ever pays attention to the local school board, raise your hands if you know all the members of your local school board. You'll notice my hand is down too.
Yeah, so, I'm sorry.
So I think those are some of the differences between the United States and Europe that account for the distinctions we see.
And I would, yeah, that was great. I do admit a time or two to thinking, well, yeah, I can do a church side hustle. People want to believe I'm charismatic. Why not? Bring in a few bucks. Cat food is very expensive. Now, this goes a little deeper than I am aware, but Reinhold asks, Lamarck and Darwin thought differently about evolution. Can you explain the difference, of course, in 30 seconds or less, and take a stand on one or the other? This sounds like a biology teacher bar fight about to break out, and I'm sorry if I allowed that to happen unwittingly.
Sure. So Lamarck's name has become attached to a doctrine called the doctrine of inherited characteristics. And this is very roughly the idea that the blacksmith will have brawny sons because he spends all his day whacking chunks of iron with a hammer. And so Lamarck thought that heredity worked in such a way that these acquired um, uh, characteristics would be passed down to offspring. And Lamarck was certainly not unique. I mean, that was pretty much common biological wisdom in those days. Now, Darwin actually did not have a very good understanding of inheritance. And although he didn't have a lot of time for Lamarckianism, this doctrine, in The Origin of Species in 1859, he had enough problems trying to get natural selection to work well with inheritance as it was understood at the time, that in later editions of The Origin, he gives more and more credence to Lamarckianism. So historically, there actually isn't that much of an opposition between Lamarck and Darwin, even though biology textbooks often kind of put it that way because a conflict narrative is a compelling narrative. At this juncture in time, Lamarckianism is pretty much discredited. Occasionally, there are attempts to revive it in one form or another, including as epigenetics, which I think the claims for have been overstated, but we're not going to do a graduate biology seminar here and now. That was more than 30 seconds, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was joking. I was joking. I did not truly want you to feel rushed, but we are at the top of the hour. But I do want to get in one more question, if that's all right. Richard wants to know, would it not make sense to include in middle school science teaching across the board a definition of quote theory as scientists understand it, so that students wouldn't be so easily swayed by arguments like evolution is just a theory?
Well, good question. A explanation of theory is in the ancillary materials to the next generation science standards, Appendix H, if you want to go look it up. And textbooks in any area of science usually has some little section on the nature of science that includes a discussion of what a theory is. And crucially, as Richard says, it's important for students to know that in science, to call something a theory is not to patronize it. A theory isn't just a guess or a hunch, a speculation or a conjecture. A theory is an explanatory system for a range of phenomena. So that's important. That's already in middle school textbooks and standards. We don't know to what extent it's taught. And one of the questions, in fact, that the new survey from NCSC is investigating is what middle school teachers teach about these things and how. For example, we're asking what resources they use. All that said, I don't think that teaching middle schoolers this specific fact about the scientific usage of the term theory is going to have a drastic effect. I think a lot of them are already taught about it, and we're yet in the situation that we're in. So it's only a very small piece of the puzzle, I think.
I guess that question comes from every little bit counts, but I guess you could tell neither him nor I have a junior high schooler to even be aware of that on the ground. But Glenn, thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you for joining us this evening. And for all of you, if you missed any of tonight's presentation, it has been recorded and it will be available at skepticalinquirer.org. And as always, my thanks to Skeptical Inquirer, the Center for Inquiry, and of course to all of you in the audience who made time to join us this evening or to watch the recording. I'm so glad we had this time together. And my name is Leanne Lord. Thank you and good night.